Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome to Fireside Chat with the founders of Augur here. We've got a lot to talk about, but I know there's some questions for the audience, and so I just wanted to get a sense of how much time we should leave for Q&A. Would you please raise your hand if you've got a question for these guys? All right. We've got a couple out there, so we'll save a little bit of time. But to get started, would you guys introduce yourselves and kind of your role in Augur and what you're doing today?
Sure. So my name is Joey Krug. I'm co-CIO at Pantera Capital. We're an investment firm in the space where we solely focus on the cryptocurrency space and blockchain tech. And I helped get Augur started early on, and yeah.
And Jeremy?
My name's Jeremy Gardner. I am currently the managing partner of Awesome Ventures, which is an impact-oriented hybrid venture hedge fund that I launched about 3 months ago. Previously, I helped found a distributed magazine, Augur, and while there, helped run the operations, raise the money for our token sale, and then departed and joined Blockchain Capital as entrepreneur in residence.
And I know everyone's eager to talk about Augur's launch as of about a week and a half ago, but I want to start kind of at the beginning. Would you guys tell us a little bit about how the idea for Augur came together and even what Augur is?
Want to take the first part? I'll take the second.
Yeah, so the way the idea kind of came about is, so prediction markets are a very old idea. They're a very generic kind of tool for creation of financial markets. And so basically, the idea behind Augur is there's kind of three fundamental problems with financial markets today. One is that they're pretty segregated. So it's very rare that if you're trading, say, Apple stock, that someone in China is on the other side of that trade. The second problem is that it's very difficult to create new financial markets. So if you want a market to exist on something that currently doesn't, your best options are either give up or pay Goldman, a few $1 million and they'll write you a custom contract. And even then, it won't be exchange traded. It'll be custom bespoke, and maybe you can find a counterparty for it. And so that's the second problem it aims to solve. And the last problem is, of course, the fees in financial markets are just really high. Whether that's betting on a sports match or whether it's an actual financial market, the fees are pretty high, whether it's to create a market or even to just participate in one. And so those are the three problems Augur kind of sets out to solve.
Yeah, I mean, when we read the first white paper for a decentralized prediction market platform, it was in the summer of 2014, and back then we had the first decentralization craze. I remember BitPay had these stickers that said, decentralize all the things. Yeah. What wasn't clear what those things were or how they were going to be decentralized, but we were going to decentralize them. And I found that kind of aloof, confusing. I was like, why would you want to decentralize most things? But as an early user of InTrade, back in 2008 and 2012 in the presidential elections, as a teenager, I had made a ton of money betting on the electoral college outcomes and had seen how these prediction markets, betting on what's going to happen in the future, were actually this really great way of predicting the future. But unfortunately, shortly after the 2012 election, InTrade was shut down. There wasn't really another global prediction market platform. And a lot of this was due to regulations, fears around gambling laws, and centralization was an issue all around. And so this was actually a use case that made sense. Mm-hmm. And I think we hopped at the opportunity. Joey and I actually had a point-of-sale startup that we were working on that we very quickly abandoned to pursue what would become Augur.
And so what is a decentralized prediction market?
So a decentralized prediction market, in other words, is an unstoppable online betting platform that predicts the future. It's very similar to a stock market, but instead of buying and selling shares in what you believe the future price of a company will be, you buy and sell shares in the future outcome of any publicly determinable event. It can be an election, it can be a sports match, it can even be the future price of a company. But it's open-ended, as long as it's publicly verifiable. And once again, similar to a stock market, you buy and sell these shares and what you believe is going to happen. So will France win the World Cup? People can buy yes or no shares. more people are buying yes shares, let's say the shares cost between less than a penny and $1, and more people are buying France shares, it may be 60 cents for a yes share, and correspondingly 40 cents for a no share. And what you get from that is the probability the market assigns to the event occurring. That 60 cents for a yes share, it represents a 60% probability that the market assigns. If you believe otherwise, you should buy shares in whatever direction you believe the outcome is going towards.
And Joe, you mentioned kind of these three problems, and especially in terms of liquidity and fees in traditional financial contracts. How does a decentralized prediction market like Augur address those issues?
Yeah, so if you think about what this tech's good for, especially if you think about what Ethereum's good for, and the differences between it and Bitcoin, the one kind of key difference is that with Bitcoin, you can just send value around. With Ethereum, you can send that value to a computer program or a contract that then does something accordingly. It takes money and escrows it and pays it out to someone under some certain condition. Mm-hmm. And so if you're thinking about financial markets, not having to operate that in a centralized fashion is very useful, because there's a huge overhead and cost associated with storing customer funds, processing trades, escrowing money, coordinating payouts, creating markets, and doing all this sort of stuff that with Ethereum you can just outsource. Now, Ethereum right now isn't super scalable, so it's not necessarily cheaper than in the regular world. There's some things you can do cheaper on Augur today. Like if you want to create a new market, you can create one on Augur right now for 40 or 50 bucks. And in the real world, that's not going to be possible. But if you're trading on it, it may cost you $5 to do a trade, which is pretty expensive right now. As Ethereum scales, though, that will change.
So fees and scalability is something I definitely want to get into, because I've gotten a lot of questions about that. But let's go back to the beginning again. You guys were working on a payments app. How did the idea for Augur come together, and what did those early days look like?
So the early inspiration was this white paper we saw for Decentralized Prediction Market Platform. There was a lot of things that were wrong with it, but the idea that you could build something like that on top of a blockchain was fairly compelling right as we began to dig into the idea. And we had joined another startup that was trying to build all sorts of different things. We didn't really have any sort of direction, but we pretty quickly, Joey and I at least, laser focused in on what would become Augur, realized that this company that we had wasn't going to work. It wasn't focused. Augur would have to have some sort of nonprofit model, because creating an unstoppable online betting platform that predicts the future has some systemic risks associated with it. And so we went about and created a nonprofit entity and started focusing singularly on building Augur. Although what we first focused on was a Bitcoin-based prediction market platform.
And when was this?
This was in the fall of 2014, very early fall.
Fall of 2014. So we're talking about 4 years ago.
Joey was 19.
And so in the early white paper, you guys talk about building this unstoppable prediction market based on Bitcoin. What changed?
So it turns out it's really difficult to build on top of Bitcoin. And I think that's still true today, especially if you're trying to build anything that involves smart contracts or anything really involving escrowing money and paying it out. Because Bitcoin's scripting environment or programming environment is very limited. And so we basically, it took us about a month to build on Bitcoin. And in December of 2014, late December, tried to build that on Ethereum and was able to do it in about a day. And it still took from that day, 3.5 years later to actually see it launch. And so I think if we were still building on Bitcoin, it probably wouldn't launch for another decade or ever.
So 3.5 years, still an incredible amount of time to get kind of from inception on Ethereum to a production-ready, decentralized application that's custodying real money. Why did this take you guys so long?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different reasons. At a high level, I think the best way to explain it is think about how NASA has to program rockets, and they have to make sure that they don't blow up mid-flight. They have to make sure there's no mistakes. Now, imagine if all of that was open source and publicly available to everyone online. And then at another layer, and imagine if anyone in the world could call functions on that rocket, and if they found a bug in the open source code, they could call a function on it that could cause the rocket to blow up. That's akin to the challenge of creating decentralized apps in the sense that your code is open source, it handles financial stuff, doesn't handle lives, but it handles money. And anyone anywhere in the world can find a bug and exploit it publicly. So if you look at the existing financial system, it's not really that secure either. It's just hard to see the code because it's all closed source, so it's not exploited too often. But even stuff like Swift got exploited for a few $1 billion a year or two ago. So that's one reason. And then if you dig down a bit deeper, the other reason is just the sort of stack of stuff that we're building on, the infrastructure here, is not super mature. So if you look at Ethereum itself, we are the first people to pay to have Solidity audited. That's the programming language on Ethereum. We were also the first people to pay to have Serpent audited, which is the programming language that came before Solidity. We found a bunch of vulnerabilities in that language and had to end up actually rewriting our entire code base because that language is essentially broken. So there's all these sorts of little things that when you're building on something super nascent, you either have to give up or solve the underlying infrastructure problems before you can push forward. It's kind of akin to building on the very early internet. And the trickier part of it is trading is kind of like trying to stream 4K video in 1997 or something. It's not an easy use case to start off with, but it's the one I think makes the most sense.
Yeah, I'll just add, Augur is the rocket ship of Ethereum decentralized applications. It is the most complex set of smart contracts that have ever been deployed, and perhaps ever will be, just given our experience. And so you have to give these guys a ton of credit. I've never written a line of code, but what they've done is absolutely remarkable. They have actually launched a consumer-facing, fully decentralized application that not only works, doesn't have any major vulnerabilities. Nobody's had large amounts of money lost. It's remarkable. Most attempts at doing things like this, like the DAO, have failed. The failure is not an option because what it creates is massive setbacks for the industry as a whole. So that loss of faith, if a decentralized application like Augur were to fail, would be monumental. It's a risk we couldn't afford.
And knowing what you guys know now, what advice would you give to all the aspiring decentralized application developers out there?
Yeah, I would say, one thing that we found to be very important is doing lots of security audits on the code. We found tons of issues and vulnerabilities by doing that. Most people don't do that, or they kind of, half bake it and hire one or two groups of people to audit it and don't actually find all the issues. We obviously haven't found all the issues. There's always going to be vulnerabilities and unfound issues in software. But I can tell you for sure that if you hire one or two groups of people to audit your code, you will find less than 20% of the issues that you could find if you hired like 6 or 7 from personal experience.
Gotcha.
So that's a big one. Also running things like, really just doing lots of things to take care that your code is actually secure. It's running things like linters and static analyzers to make sure that there aren't common vulnerabilities in your code, stuff like that. And then the other thing I would say is when you're building something in this space, you really do kind of have to go back to the old school, like waterfall style software development. Agile doesn't work very well here, and that's part of the reason why Augur took so long is we initially, for the first couple of years, tried to do like agile development, where you make something small, then you iterate on it. So like we started off, we made something that wasn't super scalable from the reporting side, and then tried to make it more scalable. And when you're building on something like Ethereum that's kind of so low level, you sometimes end up having to rewrite a ton of stuff if you do that. So the best advice I would say is specify things out on paper really well in detail, and really argue and debate over the specification on paper before starting to implement it. In regular software, you can really write a light spec and then start implementing it and then iterate on it back and forth. That doesn't work very well here, in my experience.
One thing I could have never seen coming when we built Augur was the Pandora's box that we opened when we created what was effectively the first utility token. We didn't want to really create a token. It didn't, from legal standpoints, technological standpoints, it did not seem easy, and it wasn't per se. But what I didn't expect afterwards would be this flood of utility tokens that have zero utility. I mean, like, if you look at 99% of utility tokens that came after Augur's rep, garbage, 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 garbage. So if you're building a decentralized application, ask yourself, do I need my own token? Almost guaranteed you don't. Just use Ether or whatever blockchain's token you're using. Do not create a token if you don't need to. It's unnecessary friction, and your application will never get adopted. And Augur, to use Augur, you don't even need the native token unless you want to participate in event resolution. So that I can't emphasize that enough.
So let's talk a little bit about Augur today. So Augur launched officially, what, 10 days ago?
Yeah, July 9th.
11 days? All right. And to much fanfare, press coverage all over the world, tell us a little bit about kind of how the platform's doing in the first days after the launch and how people are using it.
Yeah, so I mean, the main things are, we've come across quite a bit of UX issues that didn't appear on the test networks. So that's a good thing that we're working through that stuff now. Kind of surprising stuff was I was surprised how many markets were created. There's over something like 550 markets on Augur already. That's far more than I thought would be on it within the first week. And we've also seen, around $1 million or so traded a day. There's $1.2 million in open interest in the contracts. It's starting relatively small, but for context or for scale, CME Bitcoin futures, I looked yesterday, all the futures contracts expiring now as far as they have them, there's about 19.5 million in open interest. And so Augur's already a bit over 5% of that, which is pretty cool in my opinion. And so I think the main thing going forward now is fixing those UI UX issues that people have come across, and then longer term working on improving things like transaction costs, speed, throughput, things like that.
And of those open contracts, how much value does that represent stored or custodied in the Augur platform today?
Yeah, so right now it's about like 1.25 million, I think.
Cool.
10-day-old platform is pretty remarkable.
Yeah. And how about the types of markets that are being made? Have there been any surprises?
I mean, they're so wide-ranging. I mean, this is what is so exciting about Augur is anybody can create a market for anything. And so we see some really nerdy crypto stuff, but then you see really popular markets as well. I mean, in the first day, like $16,000 was bet on like a World Cup market. People won real money. I mean, what a lot of people fail to realize is that for the first time, you actually have a platform where if you have crypto, you can go earn more of it really easily. It's not that easy to earn crypto otherwise today, but you can make money on this platform, and I think the appeal of that will come across very quickly.
Yeah, I've heard a couple of people call prediction markets the killer app for blockchain technology.
After money.
Would you guys agree with that assessment?
I mean, it's still my favorite decentralized application, but obviously I think the idea of Bitcoin digital gold was that original conception drives all other value that exists on these platforms. So after Bitcoin, I'll give it to Augur.
Fair enough. Well, we've got about 5 minutes left. Like I said, I wanted to leave some time for questions for the audience. So we've got a couple of mics running around. Well, I'll take some questions. We've got one right here on the front left.
We'll regurgitate.
So, at the beginning you said that there are some risks in running a decentralized platform for betting. What scares the shit out of you? Like, what are you afraid that someone's going to bet on?
So I actually am not so scared in a decentralized system. It's really on the market creators and the bettors to determine whether the markets that are creating and betting on are legal in their jurisdiction. But my concern was if this is at all centralized, if there were any culpability on behalf of our team, that's where the real risk lay. And that's why we ended up having to create this utility token for decentralized consensus, because centralized event resolution pose a real systemic threat to the system. But otherwise, Augur as it exists today, there are no legal issues that I worry about for the team that's built the platform. For the people using the platform, be careful.
We've got a question right here.
Hey guys, that was really great. And it's very bold just to go out there and release Augur in the current environment. So a lot of props to you. Going back to Miami Bitcoin 2014 with Vitalik, he explained how big corporations and governments essentially create inefficiencies that don't allow markets to have perfect information. He brought up like science as one and general knowledge. Can you just briefly speak about the implications on knowledge, you know, beyond sports betting, but as a whole?
Use your
Sure.
analogy.
Yeah, so I think if you think about financial markets in general, the kind of concepts for prediction markets, in my opinion, go back to Arrow and Debrow. I think one of them was an American economist, the other one was French, and they won a Nobel Prize for this idea called complete markets, where the idea was if you had financial markets possible on anything, to speculate on anything, people could hedge against more forms of risk, and the market would be much more efficient. And so if you think of prediction markets in general, the way I view them is kind of as a tool or a neutral platform. And so if you think about how difficult it was to create or disseminate a book prior to the printing press, you had to have monks or scribes write it down and copy it. Things got lost in translation. It was a huge pain. That's kind of how I think of the financial markets as today. If you want to create a new one, new derivative contract on something, you call up Goldman or some other bank, you spend 10, 20 million bucks, have them write some custom agreement, and hope that liquidity takes off. And this is a lot of the reason why markets like the CME and CBOE haven't listed that many new things in the past decade or so, because of the fact that it's hard to get liquidity for new products, and the startup cost of doing it is just so high that it's not worth experimenting. And if you think of the world post-printing press, though, it was very easy to create a book, very easy to get distribution. And so I view Augur as kind of like the printing press, but for finance. So it's creating a way to systematically create markets that's really simple and straightforward, and anyone, anywhere in the world can access them. And the most important thing is it's going to be cheap to do it. And so if you think about, well, why doesn't the CME create more markets to speculate on? Well, if their startup cost is 10 million bucks to do it, there's not a huge incentive to experiment. If it's 20 bucks, though, you can throw a lot of stuff at the wall, and some of it sticks, some of it won't, and you keep going with the stuff that sticks.
Entrepreneurs in the room, take note. That is how you sell a product. the printing press of finance. That is just brilliant.
We've got another question on the right side.
Yes. So, pardon me. What do you think the scaling limits of Augur are?
I didn't hear. Can you repeat that?
What do you think the scaling limits of Augur
Scaling
are?
limits.
They're the scaling limits of Ethereum for now.
Yeah, so in practice, what that means is, Ethereum right now is limited to like 10 transactions or so per second. If you're looking at Augur in particular, right now I would say it's useful for things if you're placing like large trades or kind of large one-off bets. If you're actively trading back and forth a lot, that's going to be very expensive and probably not feasible for another few years, in my opinion, unless you're doing it through like state channels, which is kind of another long conversation.
Decentralized applications scale as much as the blockchains they're built upon.
So I was curious, are you guys concerned with the dark web assassination markets eventually ending up on Augur, and is there any way to mitigate this or prevent it?
Well, this is a long question. Do you guys love the blog post I wrote? I've got a blog post prepared for when someone makes a big deal out of this that I wrote like 4 years ago, but hasn't happened yet. First of all, prediction markets are just really shitty ways to kill someone. I can't emphasize that enough. The amount of money you'd have to bet to make money as an assassin is so irrational that no one would ever actually get killed that way. And I'm not going to humor this more, but no, it's just a really bad way to kill someone. People are going to create assassination markets. They're not going to have any liquidity. No one's going to use them. It's a decentralized platform.
I'd say a couple of things on that. Because I wouldn't just write the question off, because then you might leave here thinking, well, maybe they don't have an actual answer. So I would say, the way I think about it is, he's right in the sense that there are much more efficient ways of doing this. You could create a 50 to 100 line crowdfunding smart contract on Ethereum that ensures that only the assassin gets paid for doing the deed. So that's step one, is kind of punt the ball to Ethereum. The second thing I think I would say is, if you look at it from Augur's perspective, so the way this would work is you bet a lot on no and hope that the assassin buys yes, right? The problem with that is, though, that anybody else can buy yes as well. They don't actually have to be the assassin. So that's why it's such an inefficient way of doing this. And then I think the last one is just, these sorts of incentives do exist in the regular world as well. If you look at the options markets, and for the most part, most murders are very like emotionally driven things. They're typically not driven by money. I think if they were, we'd see a lot more people get killed, and large put options expiring on Tuesday and they get killed on Monday night would happen to a lot more CEOs than actually happens in practice for that reason. So I think it's kind of, there's one final thing too on this, is in Augur, the reporters in the system can choose to resolve a market as indeterminate, which basically returns the funds to the traders. And there are very few things that you can kind of get most cultures to agree on as being immoral. Assassinations is likely one of them, in my opinion. So I'd say hopefully those markets get resolved as indeterminate. But even if they don't, I don't think there's big of an issue as they seem on the surface for those reasons.
All right, last question here, because we're out of time.
Could you please briefly describe how consensus is reached about the outcome of events, and how confident are you that it's always going to work, like how robust it is, and do you see it failing under any circumstances?
That's a really good question. We wrote like a 40-page paper on it, so it's hard to answer it in like 1 or 2 sentences when we're out of time. But at a high level, I'd say the way it works is, at first, if you're the market creator, you can either choose yourself or choose someone else to submit the first report. Then what happens is it's a series of disputes or challenges. All those disputes and challenges are crowdfunded. So even if you're not super wealthy, you can still participate towards crowdfunding a dispute. And the way it works is, say you create a market on whether Trump won in 2016, and you say, no, he didn't. I can go up and contribute to disputing it and say that, yes, he actually did win. And what happens is there's a series of sequential disputes. And the rest of it is like 20 pages to explain, but the punchline is the kind of main security constraint that we have in the system is, provided the market cap of rep is greater than the amount of value being resolved at Augur at any given time by some factor, then there's no incentive from a financial perspective to attack the system. If that's not true, though, that's the answer to your question of where does the system fall apart. It's in the scenario where basically there's more value you can steal from the underlying markets than you stand to lose from the reputation system. But if you have further questions on that, I encourage you to read the paper, and if you don't understand anything in it, we have an open Discord where you can ask away. People love to talk about the game theory of the system.
Oh yeah, and let me add, because Joey and I have recently become customer support representatives on Twitter, we do have a Discord if you have questions. Tweeting at us, it's not the best way to get answers about Augur. There's a thriving community that can help you.
Well, thank you guys both, and on behalf of the whole industry, everyone's eagerly waiting and watching as Augur grows as really the first decentralized app on the Ethereum network that is resolving this type of value.
Thanks.
Thank you.